The Holy Gospel according to Matthew, the 14th chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Jesus made the disciples get into a boat and go on ahead to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, Jesus was there alone. But by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against the disciples. And early in the morning, Jesus came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost," and they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." Jesus said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, Peter became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught Peter, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped Jesus, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into a boat and go on to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. So I think we need to recall what we heard last week in worship, because what's happening here immediately comes after that story. So if you were here and awake, you might remember that Jesus found himself surrounded by this large crowd of people. I mean, Matthew tells us there were 5,000 men in addition to women and children. So realistically, there could have been 10 or 15,000 people standing there beside the sea, surrounding Jesus and his disciples. And we ask the question, why? Why were they there? Why did so many thousands of people follow Jesus away from their towns to this, as it was described, deserted place? And so last week, I think we discerned that they came seeking healing. That's why they were there. We heard in that gospel story that when Jesus went ashore, he saw this great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. The story last week went on to describe that awesome miracle of Jesus multiplying a few loaves of bread and a couple fish into a feast where all those thousands of people in the crowd were fed. But again, we talked about how that wasn't the reason that the crowds were there in the first place. They just ended up staying so late because of all the healing and the other things that Jesus was doing, that the disciples told Jesus that these crowds needed to go home before all the stores along the way closed and no one would find anything to eat. So the disciples and the listeners, us, witnessed and experienced this lesson about serving the needs of others. Witnessing how Jesus, even though he was in the midst of grieving himself, was so moved by the needs of the crowds that he felt those needs in his own gut, and he showed them compassion. And when the disciples wanted those crowds to move along, Jesus showed them again that they are the ones called to serve and to provide the sustenance for the crowd, even though they thought they didn't have enough. And again, another thing we heard last week was this reminder that these stories that we're hearing right now follow a whole bunch of parables that Jesus tells in Matthew's gospel. Parables about what the kingdom of heaven is like. And so we're moving. We're getting into the meat of the gospel, where it's no longer about what the kingdom of heaven is like, but instead experiencing it for ourselves and showing others what it is. So then we get to today. And the first thing we hear is that Jesus shoos the disciples away. Go on, go ahead. He tells them to get into a boat and go on without him to the other side of the sea. And then he turns back around and begins to dismiss the crowds. I've always wondered why Jesus sends the disciples away first. Does he tell them to go away, and then once they're far enough out that they can't hear him, he turns back around to the crowds and goes, I am really sorry about those guys. They are still learning. We have quite a ways to go, but we're working on them, okay? So just give them a little break. But I don't know. We'll never know. So then we hear that after Jesus dismissed the crowds, he goes up the mountain by himself to pray. This is what Jesus was trying to do last week. If you remember, Jesus had just received word that his friend and his forerunner, John the Baptist, had been murdered. He'd been beheaded and executed by King Herod. So as you'd expect, Jesus was sad, probably angry, and maybe even a little fearful over this news and what that might mean for him. And so he begins to go and try to find some time to be alone. And he goes off to this deserted place, we're told, which is exactly the place where all those thousands of people in this crowd find him. So now, take 2. Jesus tries again to go find some time alone so he can grieve and pray by himself. And it sounds like he did get some time alone. But as we heard, as Jesus is up on the mountain, he's overlooking the sea, and he can see the boat where the disciples are. But the boat is being battered by the wind and the waves of a storm. And so, down the mountain, away from his respite, Jesus comes again. But instead of walking around the shore, around the sea to go meet the disciples on the other side, Jesus, no, I'm going to take a shortcut. And he goes, where? Straight across the lake. No, he doesn't find a boat that's just waiting for him on the side of the shore. And no, he doesn't pull a Moses and pull out a staff and part the water so he can just walk right across. But instead we hear he walks right on top of the water. It's a fairly familiar story to many. But every time that I think about this occurrence, this situation of Jesus walking on the water, when I picture it, I always forget about the storm. I have this picture in my mind of Jesus majestically walking across the top of the water with the sun shining and birds chirping and just himself glowing, you know? But I'm reminded in this story that the water he was walking on was rocking and rolling. There were waves and wind, and that's where Jesus shows up. That's where he appears to comfort and save the disciples who were in the boat. So for those disciples, that had to be a scary experience. But then comes another detail in this story that I always seem to overlook. We hear that the disciples were terrified, but it doesn't say, at least Matthew doesn't tell us, that they're terrified because of the storm. They were terrified because they saw someone walking on the water toward them. They said, "It's a ghost," and they cried out in fear when they saw Jesus. They were fishermen, of course. They knew that this sea that they were crossing was notorious for strong winds and wave. They expected to be alone in that journey. They've experienced it before. But they knew that most likely they would emerge on the other side of the sea, maybe only slightly harmed. What they weren't expecting was for Jesus to show up in the middle of the sea, in the middle of the storm, in the middle of it all. But of course, that's exactly what he did. And in the midst of their terror and crying, Jesus speaks to them and says, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." I've heard that a more literal translation of this statement from the Bible might be of good courage, I am. And if you'll remember, that's that same phrase that God tells Moses back in the Old Testament, when Moses asks God, well, what is your name? The people are going to want to know. What am I supposed to tell them? And God says to Moses, tell them, I am. Jesus is reflecting that. Jesus is telling his disciples that he comes in the name of God. And just a few sentences later, at the end of this story, we hear that those in the boat worshiped Jesus, saying, truly you are the Son of God. And that right there is the first time in this whole gospel when another human being declares Jesus to be the Son of God. This event is a turning point. But of course, there's Peter. Of course there's Peter. The one who just won't believe it. When the disciples say, it's a ghost, and Jesus says, no, it's me. Remember me? Peter looks at him and says, well, Lord, if it is you, just command me to come out to you on the water. I'm not sure I believe. Jesus usually doesn't grant a lot of signs that the disciples ask for, right? But here's an exception. He says, all right, come on out. And Peter does. He gets out of the boat, and Peter walks on the water until the winds that are still there blow him about, and the waves come crashing over his feet, and those things remind him that he is walking on top of water. And at that point, he realizes what's going on. He freaks out a little bit, and he begins to sink. He calls out for help, but he's caught by Jesus, and they return back to the boat. And Jesus says, you of little faith, why? Why did you doubt? And I think the natural assumption for us is that the doubt that Jesus is asking him about is the doubt where Peter gets scared and begins to sink. Right? That's what we see. Peter gets out, but then he starts to doubt. He fears, he sinks. But really, if you look closely at this story, Peter doubts twice. Once, as he walks out onto the water and gets scared. But also, as we heard earlier, as Jesus arrives to the boat and declares that it is he, Peter says, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. Lord, I'm not sure about this. Give me a sign so I can believe. How often do we ask for those signs? So Jesus appears. He says, hey, it's me. Peter still doesn't believe. Does Peter not expect Jesus to show up in those fearful moments? In the middle of storms? In the middle of the unknown? Where does Peter expect to experience God? Well, we hear the same kind of expectation in our first reading with Elijah. Elijah was running and hiding. He had just proven to the people the power of his God over the power of their God. And after all of that, he rounded up all of their prophets, the prophets of Baal, and killed them. And so Elijah was running from their king, assuming that the king was out to get him. And he also might have been hiding from God, thinking that even though he was quite zealous for the Lord and doing this in God's name, that God, may not be totally pleased with all of the killing he's done. And yet God still shows up. God speaks to Elijah and tells him to go outside, for he says, the Lord is about to pass by. And then we hear one of my favorite passages when it comes to how we are to listen for God's voice and look for God's presence. Because again, we expect God to show up in those big, grand, powerful experiences, even though Peter doubted when Jesus showed up in that. And so I think it felt like Elijah felt the same. So he went outside, and all of a sudden there was this great and powerful wind, and Elijah thought, surely God's got to be there, but says God was not in the wind. And then there was this great earthquake, and Elijah thought, surely God has to be here, but God was not in the earthquake. And then there was a great fire, but God was not in the fire. But then where does God show up? In the sound of sheer silence. Defying all expectations, God shows up in that silence for Elisha and speaks words of life and hope. Defying all expectations, God shows up in the middle of a storm to the disciples and to Peter, and reaches out his hand to save them and to save us and to calm those seas. Defying all expectations, God is right there when the seas get rough and our fears consume us. Whether it's in the silence or in the storms, God is there. And we see in these stories, in these Gospels, that this is why Jesus continues to set his own needs aside to care for those who are scared and hurting, to point to the places of what the kingdom of heaven is like, so that we know, no matter what, that God is there and God is with us. Amen.